Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Mark Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Mark Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society. In today's thought-provoking conversation, we talk about how businesses navigate complex ethical landscapes, political pressures, and market challenges while staying true to their values.
I will ask the question, is there even a role for corporate values in the space between what markets reward and what the law requires? To explore this, we're joined by two guests with deep but very different perspectives. Alison Taylor is the author of Higher Ground, How Businesses Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. And we're joined by Karen Wood, who's an experienced non-exec director and chair of the board of South 32, a global mining and metals company.
Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to both of you.
Alison, let's start with you if we may. You've challenged business orthodoxy from the outside and advised from the inside. You're also one of the sharpest critics of shallow purpose statements. Why does the domain of values and ethics matter to you personally?
Thank you so much for having me. I think it is almost the most fascinating time to be discussing these topics. I believe there's a lot of very bad counterproductive advice out there, and so I am personally invested in trying to cut through the noise and bring a little bit more clarity to this whole conversation. But wonderful to be here.
Karen, people often wonder what's happening on the inside at the highest level of corporates, and in particular, in high-risk sectors and industries. Now, you sit right inside the guts of these types of rooms, and yet you have a deep and profound personal interest in corporate ethics and values. I don't want to say that that's necessarily unique. Please God, it's not so unique, but it's not that common. Why is it so important to you, and what's brought you to that place?
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the question and delighted to be with you. I work in a sector that has to confront the critical sustainable development challenges of our time, and it's a task that I relish. My sector is part of the problem. We extract resources with some consequential environmental damage. Some of the resources we extract contribute to environmental concerns like emissions, but we're also part of the solution. For example, the energy transition can't take place without the resources that we produce. Communities are stronger for our presence often than not. And so I don't want to squander the opportunity in the privileged position in which I find myself. And therefore, thinking about these issues, which I think underpin the essential framework for a successful business, is really what I'm interested in doing.
I'm interested to hear from both of you on why we need values. Do values really matter? Why is simply doing business within the parameters of the law not enough? So just a really fundamental question on what's the role of values.
Obviously, I think it's been a long time since we could rely on legal compliance as a proxy for ethics. I'm not sure that has been true since the advent of globalization. We're now in a world where legal compliance and regulations and government pressures are becoming increasingly internationally inconsistent. How business creates value has moved from the tangible to the intangible. So public perception, trust, this is also closely related, of course, to the rise of social media, generational value shifts, vastly more awareness of negative externalities have all vastly changed the context for business. So it's easy to say business should care about these things. It drives long-term value and the arguments that we're all very familiar with. But I think the way I would answer the question is values are now an imperative, because if you don't have public trust, you will not retain your value. Without values, you do not retain your value. And I think to suggest that businesses can operate just as profit maximizing black boxes without any reference to the external context is just anachronistic.
Look, I completely agree with Alison's positioning there. The way I think about values is that they are enablers of value. So absent values, there's little point in devoting effort to the creation of value because it's going to be undermined. And maybe if I could just give you an example, Lindsay, in my sector about where, for example, the law has been inadequate, but where companies collectively have come together to instigate some reform that I think really at its heart had a moral purpose. And it came out of the very devastating effects of tailings dams failures in Brazil. And you'll remember a couple of incidents which were really horrendous and tragic for both of the communities that were involved. This was a response that was really initially inspired by the Church of England Pension Board, who obviously have very strong moral underpinnings to the work that they do, but they brought pressure to bear on participants in the sector to come together and design a standard relating to the construction of tailings dams and the maintenance of those dams. And that has been incredibly successful. It was picked up by the International Council of Mining and Metals. A standard was published, and that is now the way in which tailings dams have to be audited and certified. I think that is very much a values-based response that the industry reacted to. Now, you can criticise the industry for being in that position in the first place, and that wouldn't be unreasonable. But I think the way in which the companies that participated in that process with the ICMM came together and responded in that way with push from an activist, but a constructively activist shareholder, is a very positive illustration of where the law hasn't answered the problem, but the values underpinning the outcome are very much present.
Can I come in there, if I may, and provide a provoking question, perhaps from the cynics out there? Wouldn't it be true to say that all the companies in the world have got their value statements? Even Enron had integrity as a value. On the same day, they were probably running an induction for new starters, teaching them the values on the day that it was sort of burn, baby, burn. And right up until today, we see some challenge to the notion, as you said it, Alison, and I made a note of it, without values, you do not retain your value. Wouldn't some cynics say it appears that some companies retain a lot of value in terms of the market economy in the strictest financial sense and do not practice their values? That's the cynical pushback. Isn't that partly true? Some truth in that? Do they really work, values?
There's a lot of truth to what you just said. In fact, MIT did some research on corporate values statements and found that there's convergence around 9. And you're exactly right that integrity is the most popular. And everybody is committed to integrity and teamwork and professionalism. And these are vague commitments for a reason, because when regulatory challenges arise, they enable companies to make plea deals without admitting liability. We can see certainly that there are many companies with predatory business models out there that are making lots of money. There is a common argument in the sustainability world that this is about long-term versus short-term, but we can think of companies like Philip Morris and ExxonMobil and Amazon that all think very long-term. I don't think you're wrong to highlight that this is very often seen as compliance theatre, or this is seen as empty messaging and a way to deflect the regulator. But I think the way I would counter this is Enron went bankrupt our negative externalities, the negative impacts that a business has on human beings are in fact the source of all its risks and all its potential problems. Now, how those risks and when those risks manifest is very unpredictable. And it's certainly true that you can live a long time and thrive a long time with a predatory business model. But the question is, I think, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do you want to expose yourself to that level of risk for the long term? And is there an argument for rethinking this, given that we all live on the same planet? I see younger generations wanting something completely different. I see a thirst for new leadership. I also see a lot of people in leadership positions that want to lead ethically and just really don't know how. I think it's very easy to be cynical about this. There is a reason that every time I say I work on business ethics, I'm usually met with an eye roll and a cynical comment. So you're quite right to identify the problem, but I think there are quite profound shifts going on in how business thinks about these topics.
So how inside a boardroom do we take the values statement off the shelf and make sure that it really does have resonance throughout the organisation? If I take the values of the company whose board I now chair, it doesn't actually have integrity in it. It has care, excellence, togetherness and trust. And those things we have fed into our thinking about what our purpose statement is. And it's the purpose statement that is the umbrella under which we have defined the strategy for the organisation. And the intersection of all of those things gives us, we hope, the culture we need in the organisation to deliver against the purpose statement. Now, I'd love to talk more about purpose because it is one of those subjects that I think could be subject to the same sort of criticism that you've given to value statements, Mark. It is often something that's crafted and put on a shelf and people pull it out every now and again. I think purpose statements, to be valuable, need to be operationalised. And in the operationalisation of a purpose statement, I think it's where the values come to the fore. I also think that the board has a very real role to play in ensuring that the culture of the organisation does reflect whatever those stated values are. And that's not an easy thing to do. In fact, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but it's incumbent upon boards to figure out ways inside their own organisations with their own dimensions and dynamics to test the culture of the organisation and ensure that they get some level of confidence that the values are more than that dusty booklet sitting on the shelf.
We're keen to get into, how does this show up in practical terms and to really get your insight into how values are playing a role or relevant to real decision-making that's going on within businesses. But before we do that, what's the current landscape or status quo? I know that you comment on this a lot, Alison, but increasingly what I hear is, well, of course, we'd love to take action in line with our values, and the but is always market dynamics. So get a lot of, we'd like to do the right thing, but I suppose back to Mark's challenge. But I also see a lot of really, really deeply concerned individuals who are really quite concerned about the future. I'm seeing a drift, though, away from a focus on values. You've given a really compelling case for why they matter. You've talked about some of the drivers and given a long-term perspective of why. I'm interested in what you see, kind of what is, not what should be. What trends do you see right now of how businesses are either really leaning on their values hard because it's a challenging time, or kind of backing off and distancing themselves, being pragmatic?
I think what I see, and especially when I work with businesses in a global context, is not so much a backing away from values, but companies being caught between opposing values systems or caught in expectations that they can't possibly meet. So in an international context, I think so many examples of either geopolitical conflicts or trade conflicts or consumers in one region wanting something different from consumers in another region. And so I think that's a really big part of the landscape. And then something else which really featured strongly in the introduction to this podcast is that there is a current orthodoxy at the moment that the reason we're seeing a sustainability pushback is that we made too much of a values case and not enough of a business case. Now, I was around in that period from 2015 to 2020, and I don't think that is what was happening. And if you look back at the statements at the time, it's not so much that people were making a moral case and saying that you need to do this no matter what, and even if there's no business case, it's more that people were making an exaggerated blanket business case and not acknowledging the very real trade-offs. So I think now we can see that there's a lot of backlash against sustainability in some particular markets. I think leading companies, and I would cite Unilever as one example, but there are many others. We can also think about Pepsi and how it responded to its recent kind of resetting of sustainability goals. But I think what we're seeing is a shift from maybe over-promising and saying that there's a business case, everything is material, we will keep all our stakeholders happy, to something a bit more sober and focused and restrained that takes into account legitimacy and leverage to a greater degree than before. I think the final thing I would say is, I think if you focus on that very narrow operational ROI, you miss a lot of the big picture and the strategic imperative for sustainability. So I think leading companies are still observing double materiality, let's say, but maybe focusing on 1, 3, 4 really highly strategic issues rather than trying to tick the box.
I'm, as you know, concerned about that tick box mentality and that we're not going to tick box our way through the challenge, the transition that we're going through here. Before we come into decision making and how values show up, I'm just interested in how you're reading the landscape, whether it's around values or around purpose right now.
Let me just come back to a comment Alison made about trade-offs, because I think at the heart of a successful purpose is the acknowledgement that there will be trade-offs, and those trade-offs have to be highlighted. The trade-offs have to form part of the debate about decision-making. They have to be socialised in a way that people understand why decisions have been taken. In my sector, those trade-offs are often related to sustainability or community issues. They might, for example, be transitioning from one fuel source to another with very significant community consequences for employment. In some cases, it's a question of whether some of the heavy power use facilities can even survive in a world where we're transitioning, given power costs these days. But if you don't explain the decision in the context of the trade-off that has been made, then the purpose becomes totally meaningless. So when I say the time to talk about purpose, I'm really talking about, it's not helpful to talk about a meta purpose for business at the moment that endeavours to embrace all of the sorts of issues Alison highlighted that occupied us all for half a decade. Now is the time, I think, to have a bespoke purpose specifically designed for the business at hand, and to make sure that as decision-making takes place under the umbrella of that purpose, there is real consideration given to the trade-offs that we've been talking about. And I think in that way, purpose then becomes an instrument of communication and not that rather fearful, everyone's got to have, 3/4 of purpose statements, have sustainability aspirations in them. Move away from all of that and have something that people can actually relate to both inside and outside the company and see it working.
I guess it's a question for all of us and a broader question. If I take some of the more extreme challenges that I have come to hear in quieter spaces in the corporate world more recently, a view that says, go woke, go broke. If we take away the cynical, more negative connotation that brings about in its language, is there something in that criticism that one takes seriously, or does one just discount it entirely? Is there something in it that one listened to? What is your opinion on a perspective like that and saying all the purpose and values and ethics stuff that has been worked on so hard in recent years in the corporate world is a trade-off of the most fundamental purpose of business, which is shareholder returns. And that the idea that stakeholder capitalism is possible without reducing returns in financial terms to shareholders is a fantasy.
Let's start with go woke, go broke. The people that make these arguments are making a Milton Friedman argument, the business of business is business, stick in your lane, focus on shareholder value, do not go out there with wider societal goals. That is itself a construct. Those same people certainly want the campaign finance to keep flowing. They certainly do not want a real separation between business and politics. That said, the companies that have been pushing this woke messaging, I think in many cases are also guilty of suggesting they're going to solve societal problems they are not in fact placed or well structured to solve, taking energy in some cases away from the political process. I'm very struck by how my students will say to me, there's no point in voting, it's a gerrymandered system, but I could push a company, I could push a brand, I could push my employer to do something about an issue I care about, and that will be more effective. So I do think there is an element here where we're saying that corporations have overpromised and positioned themselves to solve societal challenges they are not well placed to solve. And then the other dimension of this is that we, in sustainability, tend to treat reputational risk as a proxy for social license to operate, where there is a lot of evidence that, in fact, leading companies are more likely to get criticized and scrutinized and looked at precisely because they're leading companies. I think the relationship between business and politics and civil society is a problem. I think it's a problem in both frames. I think it is a problem to say business can be completely disconnected from politics. It's also a problem to say that business can take on problems that the government is better suited to solve. And so this is why I said earlier, I think we need a new era of focus and legitimacy and restraint. But to your point that shareholder value and stakeholder value are always antithetical, I just don't accept that. Any business that ignores its customers, employees, suppliers, and communities is not a business, I don't think, with a long-term future, particularly given how transparency and reputational dynamics are evolving. So that's a debate people spend a lot of time on, but I'm just not sure that's a kind of good binary, like you focus on shareholders or you focus on stakeholders. I think the problem is the sort of over-promising and generic commitments to stakeholders do not acknowledge or resolve or address the kind of challenges that Karen talked about. And mining is the perfect example of how we confuse quality of operations and context. The context of mining is so incredibly risky that even if you do a very good job, you're still going to be exposed to and contributing to a lot of risks. And I think a big problem in the sustainability discourse is that we mix up context and performance.
It's music to my ear to hear this focus from both of you on openness about the trade-offs and brush exaggeration. My concern is nobody's telling the truth about the real choices we have ahead. There's either a very idealistic utopian view of what's possible that simply isn't relatable for many people, or a kind of a complete, well, we can do nothing, ignoring the fact this is a construct. Politicians that need to be elected aren't necessarily incentivized to tell the truth while somebody else is selling easy solutions, and business don't necessarily have a vested interest in also telling the truth. But without greater honesty, we're going to be stuck. So acknowledgement of trade-offs feels a really fundamental point and a real act of leadership. But we've just heard a lot about the mining sector. I'm keen to come to you, Karen, either to respond to that provocation from Mark or to kind of bring to life how this really plays out in the context that you're in. You've already given a great example about tailings dams, but what's your response to the provocation there?
Look, the resource sector, the mining sector, cannot afford to operate without thinking about the broad range of stakeholders who are impacted by its business. I mean, large sums of money are put up front to develop a resource, very often in vulnerable communities in the global south, often on lands held by traditional owners. If the community does not want you there, you will not be there. In addition to the operations themselves, there is very often very strong financial support for all of the social amenity that's required in some of these regions, health, education, and so forth. So the intersection between the value that's added to local communities and the wealth generated from the mining or resource activity is very real. And this sector, for all of the criticism it gets for the reasons Alison has just outlined, has been conscious of this, I think, for a very long time. Now, that's not to say it's always perfect, but the old adage we used to say was you need a license to operate. To get the license to operate, you've got to be working in a way that adds value beyond your shareholders. And because the business is by nature long-term, decades in the making in some cases, it's in the wealth creation that comes, then shareholders are more inclined to think longer term. Now, that might be wishful thinking because often when I'm talking to shareholders, they're thinking about the next set of results rather than what this is going to produce in a decade. And I think Alison is absolutely right. The disconnect between the short-term environment politically that we live in, fueled by the way in which our communication channels work these days, just conspires to work against any sort of focus on long-term thinking. But how do we think about that issue of broader social issues that we might get involved in? So I've been talking about that example by way of illustration, the communities where we're working. But what about some of these broader issues that come under that pejoratively used term of woke issues, and should we involve ourselves? And we had a fairly robust set of discussions and debates in Australia in recent times when the federal government put up a referendum to change the constitution, to instill in the constitution some rights to redress wrongs for our Indigenous population. And there was a huge amount of criticism of companies who got involved in that campaign, who put money into the campaign and spoke publicly on behalf of their companies to support that change. Now, we did support the change in the public square, but in explaining why we did that, we talked about the work that we do on Indigenous land. So the operations that we have and the views of the traditional owners of those people. So we could explain the nexus between why it was important to the traditional owners of the land on which we work and therefore important to our company. Now, that's not going to be true for every issue. And we've talked these things through at some length in the boardroom as people come and say, well, what about this issue and what about that? We can't find a nexus for the business. And therefore, we're not prepared to put the resources of the business, either financial or just in support terms, behind those things. You know, we've got to be very careful about it. Now, just because we found the nexus didn't mean we avoided criticism. We got quite a lot of criticism for our involvement. But again, I came back to the nexus, the purpose, the confidence we had that this was critically important to the future of our business as it related to Indigenous land in Australia.
That's a great example. And Alison, you were sharing this perception or this pressure on businesses to stay in their lane. I hear a lot of that. I hear businesses saying, you know, well, we'd like to take action, but, you know, we need to stay in our lane, or we're the good guys. We don't get involved in politics. It's those bad guys that are lobbying and doing that. We're staying out of it because that's what good guys do. They don't get involved in politics. But everything in some ways is political, back to this trade-offs. I mean, the science in many areas is clear. You know, the economies aren't delivering, they're not delivering for people very well. Most people deliver for some people, for nature, for climate, and it's a very broad range of political choices ahead. So you've given a great example, Karen, about how you took a decision and engaged and the nature of that. But broadly, in your views on this relationship between the private sector and politics, given that we're in the domain that we're in, on the one hand, we get to stay in your lane, and on the other hand, kind of silence or staying out is complicity. Where do you stand? What are your views on how businesses navigate this landscape?
Well, it's not easy. And we're working in a political environment today which is so short-term focused. It's antithetical to the long-term planning and strategic alignment that we need inside business. But we do need political solutions, just like we need business solutions. So we've got to find a way to make it work. I think about climate and the work that still needs to be done to take us where we've got to get in terms of emissions reduction. We cannot do that without political support. I think about the industry and take the aluminium industry, for example, where we operate. Very power intensive. Some of our facilities are still coal-fired. We can't do that transition on our own. So we need political support along that journey with us. I think some of the challenges we've seen as we've come to terms with a world that isn't united behind its aspiration to reduce emissions means perhaps we've got to think about a different way of approaching this. We might, for example, think about taking an industry view on emissions reduction, not a national view, because as we move into a world where that national cooperation, because the institutions that have fostered this are being imperiled, then it's difficult to see that we're going to get to where we need to go without something else coming to the fore. And maybe that is that business collectively on a sectoral basis might be able to confront some of these challenges. We can't ignore politics. Politics can't ignore business. We have to find a way of working cooperatively and cohesively to address these challenges.
First of all, to just agree, everything is political. To take a very fraught topic at the moment, diversity, equity and inclusion, obviously a strong political dimension, and Karen's talked about that in the Australian context already, also a very personal topic. So to divide the world into topics that are political and non-political doesn't make too much sense. Karen is also absolutely right that on many, if not most, sustainability challenges, single company action is not going to be sufficient. So I think the big problem and the big shift that is now underway is that many companies historically have been making sustainability claims in their sustainability reports, setting goals, setting commitments, very often a very dedicated sustainability team working in good faith on those goals and commitments. And then there will be somebody in the government relations team down the hall that is literally undermining what the sustainability team is doing. So we're giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And these siloed approaches, believe it or not, are the norms in many companies. And so I think part of this era where we're being more focused and restrained and thinking about legitimacy comes with making sure that our policy commitments are aligned with our sustainability commitments minimum. That is, I think, new thinking that you're seeing emerging on sustainability narratives, goals, et cetera, And then also, given that we've got institutions like the World Economic Forum and the UN in some level of crisis, I also think you're seeing policy engagement shifting from those kind of big global voluntary commitments to national level interventions on specific issues, perhaps in significant developing markets that are going to have a real impact on the operating environment. At minimum, you need to close the gap between what you're saying in the policy sphere and what you're saying in the sustainability sphere. And then I think we need much more acknowledgement of what the limits are to single company action so that we can proceed in the way that Karen described.
So let me pick up the point that you've just made and expand it at a macro level. Alison, you've just described how there are sometimes competing influences inside corporations that inhibit achieving positive sustainability vectors for the company. I couldn't help but resonate with those comments because I've just seen that in industry so often. But at a macro level, we now face in the world something which I guess at first glance seems new, where there is a complete diametrically opposed set of pressures in one geography compared to another for a multinational company. So, for example, we've seen in the United States a move with the new administration to produce pressures in the economy to mobilize vectors in one way with regards to climate action. And we see in Europe, for example, pressures from that geographical area in quite the opposite direction. And now you sit as a multinational and you have to operate in many jurisdictions. How should companies navigate the competing pressures to be able to do business in these different jurisdictions?
I think all companies are facing this dilemma because there's always a trade-off between being locally relevant and globally consistent. And then there's also a related question of, to what degree do you align your values with your host country? Do you say, I'm an American business with American values? I'm a Danish business with Danish values. I'm applying those values anywhere we are in the world. Or are you saying we're adapting to local conditions and local stakeholder dynamics? And every business has always faced those trade-offs. But as described, those trade-offs have become a lot more binary. So I think there is something about grounding what you're doing on your impact on human beings. It is not going to be very sensible, for example, to send your LGBTQ employees to work in Saudi Arabia. That's just a kind of basic duty of care that you need to exercise. And so that is the first thing. Can you protect your people, your employees, your suppliers from the risks posed by the particular market in question? The second question is to what degree you allow adaptability. And there's going to be some, obviously, allegation of hypocrisy if you are adapting to local conditions. But if you're trying to set particular global goals, you're also going to face a lot of complexity there. I'm working with one company in particular at the moment that I think is exposed globally and is really recommitting to 20th century liberal values, saying we believe in the rule of law, territorial integrity, democracy, free markets. I would like to say that I think multinational businesses might have a role right now in standing up for those liberal institutional values. I'm certainly not saying that's easy, but I think that is the kind of direction that we need to go. And then the final thing I would say is I think this all illustrates the risk of calibrating to reputational dynamics and who is yelling at you on social media or who is engaged with political retaliation at the expense of a physical reality. We could say there's a backlash against climate action in the US, therefore let's not take climate action. Or we could say physical reality still exists, and this is still a big driver of risk management and resilience. So for the moment, we're still living in the real world, and pressures like climate change are not going away and are certainly real.
These are challenges that we've always faced if you work across national borders. So any multinational company has always faced a challenge of dealing with different rules, different laws, different cultural dynamics. You know, before the governance environment was quite as harmonised as it is now around the world, there was a real effort, I think, made by some companies to governance shop. So they would take whatever governance framework they thought was that where they operated. But that is certainly not the right approach and not approach that I would encourage. And let me just try and give you a safety example, because safety is obviously something of enormous concern to my sector. It's the sector that has historically not done it particularly well. But I think over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a real evolution in the way in which we've thought about safety. If you go back 30 years, people would say, look, a life is not so important in sub-Saharan Africa as it might be in Canada, so we really don't need the same practice and process there. Let's just put some policies in place and not worry too much about that. The evolution took place when people started to say, well, look, you can have all the rules you like, all the practice, all the process, all the protocols, all the policies, but it's not going to matter a jot in terms of safety outcomes unless people actually feel like they have a personal responsibility for their own safety and the safety of the people that they are working with. And that goes for everybody, irrespective of the jurisdiction in which you're working or the value that might be placed on a life in the jurisdiction in which you're working. And that, I think, is absolutely fundamental to the way in which we traverse that landscape. And that comes itself back to values. If human life is important to you as a value, then you're going to apply the safety standards, whether it's in an impoverished African country or it's Australia. You're going to apply the same standard, whether it's an employee or a contractor that you've engaged to do a piece of work. I think also, Mark, to pick up the comment about diversity, because that has been something that we've seen so much pushback on in more recent times. What we know, and if I just stick to the safety theme, we know that a diverse workplace is a safer workplace. We know that diversity, whether it's gender or whether it's ethnicity, will deliver a much more productive environment because it's a safer environment. So there are reasons that we can attach to our purpose and our strategy that align with our values that make business sense. And again, I just come back to that point about operationalizing these tenets of the way in which we do business, because I think it behoves us all in this environment to explain why diversity is important. And if diversity is important, then inclusion has to be important, because we've all seen what happens when you set mandated targets for diversity without any strategies to deal with inclusion. They fail, whether they're legislated or whether they're the ticker box form. And so I think we can avoid some of the rhetoric that underpins the backlash by tying it to our business fundamentals and remaining true to ourselves and staying the course on these things that are so fundamentally important.
There was a huge amount of insight and leadership lessons from that. Policy positions are really important, but so too are personal accountability, a focus on operationalization and engagement with the business fundamentals, a recognition that as in some ways everything is politics, and that takes collective action. No single business can have an impact. What advice would you be giving to board directors, executives on how to navigate this disruption?
I want to go back to purpose. I know I'm harping on about this, but I do think that it is an underutilised tool, and not just in the boardroom, not just at the company level, but by shareholders. It surprises me when I have conversations with shareholders that they don't ask me about a particular decision in the context of purpose, that they're not challenging the purpose of the company, that they're not asking why the strategy is as it is and how it ties into the purpose. So putting values to one side, that's a set of conversations that I rarely have outside the company itself, unless I prompt them. And I think that's a missing trick for all of us in trying to make business work more effectively. So I guess what I would say is let's try and turn purpose into the bespoke but dynamic instrument that it can be to address the challenges that we're confronting today. And it isn't easy. I mean, Lindsay, as you said, we really do have to come to grips with the fact that there is no silver bullet for all of these sorts of issues that we're trying to grapple with. If we're lucky enough to be in positions where we can make decisions along a course to improve the lives of people, after all, I'm not sure what business is for if it's not to do that, then I think it's incumbent upon us to find ways to do that navigate this incredibly tricky environment in which we find ourselves.
And I'd just like to reinforce what Karen said, really. I think there's a global leadership crisis underway. I read thousands of papers from students about ethical dilemmas every year. They're all about bad leadership. They're all about leaders behaving as if the rules only apply to the workforce and don't apply to them. We're seeing a lot of dynamics around inequality and fairness and elite overproduction and so on. And so I think what we need to do is to move on from thinking of ethics and values as a sort of compliance-driven, reactive, after-the-fact defense mechanism, and to see it as central to strategic advantage. And I think Karen described beautifully what that actually looks like. So rather than saying we're not in an era of values, we need to go back to basics, back to ROI, I actually think we need to recenter values as an anchor that we can use in a turbulent world where none of us know what's going to happen next week. So thinking about the long term seems somewhat of a fantasy. Where do we have to anchor? I think where we have to anchor is our values.
So as we come to a close of the podcast, I think one of the important questions to ask is where things right now bring a bit of light for the future. What gives you hope in terms of the kind of leadership that you've seen?
I'm lucky enough to spend most of my time in the classroom with students. And maybe I should first of all say I don't feel hopeful and optimistic every day. It's a pretty tough time right now. But what does give me hope is spending time in the classroom. You hear a narrative out there that sustainability is over. No one told my students at Stern my classes are oversubscribed. The students want to know how to apply these tools. They care greatly about authenticity. They want to run companies in new ways. I truly believe that when the people I am teaching are running businesses and running the world will be better. And I view it as my own role to play a small part in helping them prepare and rethink and make these ideas better. So anytime I'm feeling despairing, I get myself to campus and put myself in front of students and explain and defend these ideas. And that gets me out of bed and tends to cheer me up.
I just felt the light shine from that comment and suddenly the hope returned. So it is hard at the coalface, pun intended, but that is a wonderful piece of information that I'm going to take home with me as well. So thank you, Alison. So Karen, if you can add to that, that would be great.
So I had the enormous privilege over the last couple of years to do some study at CISL, surrounded by people who were all younger than me, some of them considerably younger than me. And I listen to those people. I hear what they're doing in their workplaces. I take that back to my own company. I see what the young people are doing. I see how enthusiastic and excited they are about the opportunity. And it can't help but give you hope for the future. So, you know, for all of the discord that we get caught up with on a day-to-day basis, it really is an exciting world out there for these young folks. And I've got no doubt that they'll set us back on the right course.
Great insights. I'm reassured that if people like you, so deeply steeped in this context, can still find sources of hope, then we all can. Thank you, Alison and Karen, for joining us today. Our discussion has made clear that values and purpose are not abstract, nice-to-have concepts, but rather they're essential to shaping decisions, especially where conditions are difficult or contested. We've also heard that effective leadership today depends on clarity, honesty about real trade-offs, but also about alignment between stated commitments and business practices, and a willingness to follow through and act on principle. And we had a powerful reminder that really progress relies on people, on committed, experienced leaders who will stay grounded, stay the course, and about the inspiration that we can take from the generation that's coming through with fresh energy and resolve. Join us next time for What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Mark Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of recording and do not necessarily represent the views of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or recommendations.